Hi, everybody. I'm Leslie Maxwell. I'm an editor here at Education Week, and I'm here with Allison Klein, one of our great reporters. And we have just wrapped up a 90-minute conversation about social emotional learning in schools. And Allison hosted a room with a guest that focused on student voice. And I know you had a lively discussion in that room today. And so I just want to start by asking you, when people talk about student voice, what do they really mean by that?
So that is a great question. It's actually one that came up today in my discussion with Michelle Hammond, who's the student voice coordinator at Washoe County Schools in Nevada. And she gave some just really concrete examples of things that the district has done in response to what students have told them about everything from the dress code. Students were brought into a summit to just kind of air not exactly their grievances, but things that they wanted fixed or changed in the district. And one of the things that came up was the dress code. So the school facilitated a special breakout summit just on that issue and brought in folks from the legal department, and that gave the students a chance to really talk about this, and also to learn about what students called, or what Michelle termed, kind of inequities in dress codes, kind of across the country. So they really did their research. So basically, that's a long way of saying that student voice is giving kids a chance to weigh in on their own educations. But what it can mean is operational things like the dress code, or what is actually taught in classrooms.
Yeah, so they're really tapping into kids, not just like superficial responses to things, but what they really think and feel like they need to get out of, the most out of their education or the experience of sort of helping shape what the school environment is.
Yes, exactly. And also, they want, one of the most important components of student voice is that what the students say needs to be acted upon. It needs to be actionable. Even if the district says, gosh, we really can't change the dress code, or we really can't change the school lunch, explaining to students how that's done. Washoe actually had some of its students go and see how school lunches are prepared so they would understand some of the limitations there. I thought that was really important and interesting, and it treats students a little bit more like adults, and gives them insight in something that they obviously have a huge stake in, their own educations.
Right. Well, I know some questions came up for Michelle around, how schools can ensure that they're not just hearing from the likely suspects, the student council president or the kids that are always the ones who are eager to speak up. So what were some tips or advice that she gave around casting a wide net and making students of all, experiences and backgrounds feel comfortable being honest and sharing feedback as part of a student voice initiative?
So Washoe has a strategy that's really similar to another district that I actually wrote about last year for our Leaders to Learn From report, which was Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And kind of in both districts, they have these sort of student advisory councils. In Cherry Hill, they call them actually town halls. And in both cases, the district leadership intentionally asked the school to bring in kids from all different academic levels, different races, students in special education, English language learners, so they aren't only hearing from, the class president.
Right. How does elevating student voice work, say, with younger kids? Like, I'm thinking about the early elementary years. Are there ways to authentically include children at that age in a student voice process?
So that's a great question, and definitely one that came up in our discussion today. Luckily, Michelle's background actually is in early childhood education. So she talked about how even with kids as young as kindergarten, doing something like project-based learning can give kids a choice in what they're learning in their own educations. And then she also had talked about doing circle time, which is sort of a classroom version of these broader town halls that we're talking about, just kind of getting students talking.
And then I have one final question for you, and I wonder if it came up at all in the discussion. I think people who work in schools are professionals, and they see themselves, rightly so, as professionals. What are some of the barriers that kind of have to be broken down around the adults in schools and in districts to sort of really hear what students are saying and take it to heart? Like, they're right. We do need to change what we're doing on X, Y, or Z.
So I can speak definitely to this in Cherry Hill, the district that I profiled about a year ago. In that district, the school superintendent, Joe Malash, really just sets a culture and an expectation that all of the adults are going to take students seriously. And it's something that's practiced. It's something that he did say, took somewhat of a cultural shift. But now all of his teachers say that they embrace it. So if the expectation is sort of set from the top, he believes that will follow through to class, even to the classroom level.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for taking time today to talk with me and to host that great 90-minute discussion with Michelle Hammond.
Well, and thanks to Michelle and to everyone who participated.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Again, I'm Leslie Maxwell, an editor here at Education Week, and now I'm with Sarah Sparks, one of our reporters who hosted a discussion room today on the relationship between students and teachers as part of our summit on social emotional learning. So, Sarah, I'm going to kick this off by asking you, what goes into building a trusting, respectful relationship between a teacher and a student?
This is one of those things that is so foundational that teachers and principals often don't talk about what actually goes into it. In our discussion, the researchers were talking about the difference between perspective taking, being able to understand academically and intellectually where a student's coming from, but also the importance of understanding where they are emotionally and being able to identify what might be underlying problem behaviors.
Interesting. What were some of the effective strategies that the researchers shared in your group today particularly around teachers who are working with populations of students whose backgrounds are completely different than their own? And we know that that's often the case in schools when the teaching core is overwhelmingly white and female, and our student body is increasingly not that.
Right.
What were some of the strategies they shared?
Well, one of the things we heard over and over again was that there is very little training, very little professional development for teachers who are trying to work with these students. And one of the key strategies they gave was going through perspective taking, trying to think through how they would feel and how they might expect a student from a particular group to feel, and then talking back and forth through what that reality is. They also find that just working with students and taking the time to talk to them a little every day, maybe a minute or two every day, to acknowledge them individually and acknowledge them outside of talking about problems.
Interesting. I mean, that's got to look different, obviously, at the higher grade levels where, a high school teacher is seeing a group of kids for 45 minutes a day for one class and then turning over and seeing another group. Was there any conversation about how to sort of maximize that short amount of time and exposure that you get to your students to get beyond what you've got to, get done in that 45-minute class period?
We heard a lot about advisories, about homerooms and short periods of time that a counselor might have or a teacher in high school might have. And one of the things that came up is it doesn't take a lot of time to connect with students. It just takes a consistent time over the course of a year and really asking students how their day goes. One teacher actually, this was with an elementary grade, but they went through with the class all of the different emotions that they might have and made a chart of them. And so the teacher asks the students every morning as they come in, how's your day? And they can just point to the chart without having to get into a discussion of it.
Interesting. So you mentioned that there's very little professional development around, cultivating a good relationship with your students. So why is that the case?
Again, I think a lot of people thought this is a truism. Teacher-student relationships are important, but it's so basic that it's often assumed teachers understand more than they actually do about the concrete details of how to build those relationships. And particularly when there are cultural differences, teachers may not know how to manage that path.
Right. Well, I know a lot of the discussion revolved around empathy, building empathy, demonstrating empathy toward your students. And then someone raised, how do you do that without coming across as though you're, pitying a student? So what was the conversation there?
One of the researchers, Mary Helen Imordino Yang, talked about empathy is not pity. And empathy is not enabling a student to get away with something. It's more about asking a question about what is causing this problem behavior. If a student is falling asleep in class all the time, are they having trouble at night? Are they homeless? Asking those questions and asking the student about those questions makes them feel more listened to and respected. And there's also been research that suggests it can make teachers feel less stressed out and burned out if they're viewing students' behavior as a problem to solve or a way to increase a bond rather than a symptom of defiance.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. We're back again. I'm Leslie Maxwell, an editor at Education Week. Now I'm joined by Andrew Ujifusa, another one of our great reporters here, who hosted a good discussion about Title IV of ESSA, which is our federal education law. And we're going to start with a super basic question, Andrew, which is, what is Title IV?
Good question. So Title IV, as you mentioned, is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. It's actually new. When ESSA passed in 2015. And its official name is the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Program. And, it's supposed to be a pretty broad program that districts can use mostly at their discretion. There are three basic buckets. There's one to sort of create well-supported students and improve school climate and school safety. That can go for everything for nutrition programs, the dropout prevention, to addressing the opioid crisis. Then there's another bucket that deals with academic enrichment, as the name indicates. It can go towards, AP course enrollment. It can go towards dual enrollment, arts education, things of that nature. And districts can also use it for education technology and to address things like blended learning. So you can probably guess that it can be used for a broad application of academic and other offerings in schools. And it's not clear that districts are necessarily getting a lot of money out of the program. Right now, funding at the federal level for Title IV Part A is about nearly $1.2 billion. So when you spread that out over all the districts in
And
the
there's
United
about
States,
14,000 districts.
yeah,
Right? Yep.
so you do some quick division, and it's not a lot of money, but it might help supplement efforts that districts already have underway. So I think that's what a lot of districts are starting to use the money for.
Yeah. So our online summit was specifically about social emotional learning,
Yep.
and so Title IV is a potential source of funding that districts and schools might tap into to support some of their SEL work, correct?
That's right. And I think that, SEL is something that districts are, in many cases, are still sort of exploring, getting used to, and finding out best practices and standards. So I think there is, as with Title IV itself, in fact, there's a fair amount of maybe not confusion, but just sort of a lot of questions that folks have about, we heard from folks, for example, in our discussion about, can I even use Title IV for social emotional learning, for example? And the answer is yes, you can. But it is something that I think a lot of districts and district leaders are at least interested in exploring, using Title IV money to at least sort of boost that work that they might be getting started on.
Yeah. Well, Title IV right now in the proposed budget that was released last week by the Trump administration would be eliminated. That is highly unlikely to happen because, as far as I understand from your reporting, there's not support for Congress to eliminate that. Can you talk a little bit about the politics around, particularly Title IV budget and kind of what the debates and discussions are likely to be going forward with this budget?
Sure, that's a really good question. The politics around the Title IV funding has been really interesting. It's been authorized in terms of how much money it could get at maximum by Congress for about $1.6 billion, so more than it's getting right now. When the Parkland tragedy happened just over a year ago, funding for Title IV was at about $400 million, so way below its authorized level. And Congress responded to that in a bipartisan way by increasing the funding up to about $1.1 billion. And it was interesting because at that time, the Trump budget proposal from last year also proposed eliminating it. And then Congress said, let's give more money to school safety, and we're going to use Title IV to do that. And the Trump administration said, great, even though not too long ago they had proposed eliminating it. And now they're proposing to eliminate Title IV again. But as you indicated, Title IV is pretty popular on Capitol Hill. I think lawmakers hear a lot from districts that want to use it for various purposes. So I don't think we should expect that Congress will eliminate it. In fact, they might actually increase funding for it in the upcoming budget.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Leslie.
Welcome back, everyone. We're here to discuss a little more about our Social Emotional Learning in School Summit. Now with me is Denisa Superville, a reporter for Education Week, who hosted a really lively discussion about principals, teachers, and the adults in a school building and sort of the needs around social emotional learning for them. And she had a team from an Alaska school, principal, assistant principal, and counselor who were fielding questions. And Denisa, if you could just describe a little bit about, this is a school that is not only all in on SEL for kids, they're doing it for the adults too. And they say that that is necessary. So what does that look like in their particular school?
Okay. So Whaley School is a K-12 school for students with disabilities and a range of emotional challenges. And in an environment like that, the staff says that building relationship is important. And to build relationships with students, you also have to have that capacity as adults. So for about 8 years now, they have been working on team building exercises with the staff. So there's things like volleyball, and there's yoga for staff. A masseuse would come in during professional development to work with teachers. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the work is about just having conversations among themselves and trying to find out where they need to do better.
So I think one of the first questions that people might ask is like, how can a school do this? Like, it seems like it would just require so many resources. I think that they were asked that in the discussion room, and what was their response?
Well, it doesn't really require a lot of additional resources for them, right? So they do volunteer. One of the a member of the leadership staff is a yoga instructor, so she helps with that. And they use activities funds for the school to do that. They also have a silent auction, and they do some additional fundraising. But a lot of what they do doesn't require additional money. Starting a meeting with the good things that are happening in your school and asking people to share about that does not require a lot of money. Volleyball, team building exercises, that does not require a lot of funds. So it's something that schools can do if they prioritize it.
Yeah. Did they give any advice in the discussion room today to other educators who are maybe a little skeptical about how you would make sort of staff wellness and staff well-being, staff social emotional skills as much of a priority as that for students?
Well, it's difficult to give blanket advice on here are the five things that you can do to make this work, because you need to know where your staff is. You need to know what the hesitance is. And I think maybe the one takeaway around that is just talk to them about where they are, the reasons why they might be hesitant, and continue to have that conversation. But you have to also be clear about the kind of staff member you're looking for. And at their school, they have that discussion about whether a person is a right fit for that environment.
Yeah. And one more question that's related to that, which is they probably had skeptics and reluctance when they set out on this path with their existing team. So how did they talk about how to address the maybe the small number of staff were like, we're not into this idea at all?
Well, persistence, explaining why you think that is important, and working directly with the 80% or the 50% that's on board, so they can see evidence why this works for you. And at some point you have to be frank that there might be 10%, 5% that doesn't want to be there or doesn't fit in with the culture that you're trying to create, and then you might work with them to have them placed in another school or another environment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're here for our last interview, our last Q&A of our Social Emotional Learning in School Summit. And no better way to end it than with our expert on our reporting staff. This is Evie Blod. She covers social emotional learning for Education Week. And let me just say, you had a tremendous response in your discussion room. So many questions, so many that unfortunately Evie and her guests couldn't get to them all. But given that, let's just start with the very basic question of why is everyone so interested in social emotional learning?
Yeah, I've never been in a room like that on one of our virtual summits. The questions were moving so fast that every time I hit refresh, I just could barely keep up. The enthusiasm is really great, not just for our participants today, but at schools around the country. Enthusiasm, curiosity, interest, maybe a little skepticism about SEL. And I think part of the reason is that we've seen so many national efforts to lift up the work, to ask questions about what needs to be done, but also to show schools that have really developed successful strategies on their own. Most recently, the Aspen Institute had a national commission on social, emotional, and academic development. They worked with researchers, policymakers, educators, and they said, what would it mean to open up the focus of a school to make it more sensitive to a child's emotional and social development so that who I am relationally, who I am personally, how I set goals is all incorporated into my academic work. So that instead of fighting against a child's nature saying, man, at this age, you're extremely social and I can't get you to focus on this lesson, maybe you can make that work for you in an academic setting and say, how can I capitalize on the social nature of, say, these middle school students? How can I incorporate that into a science lesson so that they both develop in those capacities, but also learn more effectively academically? So we've got a lot of schools just saying, how do we do this? What does it look like? Who's really doing it right?
Yeah. Well, given the wide interest in it, sort of the flip side of that can be that there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding or superficial understanding or even misconceptions around social emotional learning. Can you talk about what some of those common misconceptions are?
One of the misconceptions is that SEL is a strategy or an intervention for kids with behavioral problems, and that's it. A lot of folks associate it with the debates over school discipline, which discipline is often a part of what a school will change when it adopts social emotional learning. But social emotional learning is a strategy, an approach, a lens that you view education through, and it affects how all children learn. I think another misconception might be that social emotional learning is just a program that you adopt for direct instruction, which a lot of folks who advocate for it talk about it in a more comprehensive way. They say you need an evidence-based direct instruction program, which are some of those that you hear from providers. You need to develop strategies to integrate it into your classroom lessons. And then you also need to look at your broader school and district strategies. How do I discipline students, for one? How do I engage the community in this work? How do we support our staff? How do we relate to parents and families to make sure that the needs and concerns that students have at home are addressed in school and that we're all on the same page about developing and nurturing and supporting this child?
Okay. Well, we've got one more question for you before we have to wrap up. And I feel like today I was seeing a lot of questions in your room that were pretty foundational ones. Like, we want to do this. How do we even get started in our school? How do we anticipate and sort of combat resistance that we might encounter from staff? What were some of the best practices that your guests shared today?
Yeah, well, one of the practices that they shared was Castle has a district resource center that you can go online and see how the districts that they've worked with have really carried out the work. A lot of districts started at the starting point that the Aspen Commission recommended, which is actually to define what does a successful whole child look like? What do we want our graduates to look like, not just academically, but socially and emotionally? And then to take that and identify the skill sets or competencies that you really want to nurture and support through your SEL work. And then a lot of districts have used that to say, okay, what does self-control look like in a kindergartner? What does it look like in an 11th grader? And they've done year-by-year standards to show districts and teachers and schools a more concrete idea of what this looks like.
Right.
I think that is a really difficult thing because there are a lot of platitudes people speak in. Of course, we want to nurture the whole child, but what does that really mean and how do we really do it? And so the real starting point is to engage all of those people who might be skeptical. So you're not building something and then asking them to be a part of it or telling them to be a part of it, but saying, hey, what should we build? Right. And that includes teachers, students, parents, and your whole community.
Okay. Well, thank you, Evie, so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. It was a really amazing conversation. We were really just blown away by the levels of participation and the quality of questions that came in for our reporters and guests. So remember that the discussion rooms will be archived and you can go back and read through every question and answer. It was hard to keep up with everything as the summit was unfolding. So please go back and use those resources. And thank you again for joining us.